The format of today's afternoon session will be three blocks, where we'll have documentaries in each block and a facilitated discussion following those. The first block is going to focus on transportation planning and specifically looks at the challenges and some of the solutions to making transportation support a healthier and more active lifestyle. The second block of documentaries is going to focus a little more on land use policies and zoning type issues and parking code type things, and investigate how those influence the places our streets connect us to, and how that can really either inhibit or support an active, healthy lifestyle. And the third block is more of a little teaser or a little opener into the smart cities issue. And we'll have some short comments following that. It won't be a big panel discussion. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our peer experts. FHWA and FTA have provided support to host the two national panelists, and they will participate in the first two blocks of documentaries. So Philip Erickson in the middle is the president of Community Design and Architecture, a city planning and urban design firm based in Oakland, California. Phil's a planner, urban designer, and architect with extensive experience in community and urban design, land use, and transportation planning. Phil's worked with urban, suburban, and rural communities to help transform their streets and places through planning, design, and policy to support walking, biking, and transit use. He's authored national standards on the integration of street design, land use planning, and stormwater management. David Vega-Barachowitz is a senior urban designer for the New York City Department of City Planning and has led the development of the innovative National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, street design guidelines to promote walking and bicycling as the director of the Designing Cities Initiative at NACTO. Additionally, he co-authored the Startup City, Inspiring Private-Public Entrepreneurship, Getting Projects Done and Having Fun, which showcases how innovative ideas that start as simple pilot projects can grow from experiments into major improvements that support healthier, more active lifestyles. And David, you might wonder, I was in Washington, D.C. last week at a different meeting, and I had gone to a museum gift shop the last time I was in DC in December, and I saw this really cool bag and I didn't buy it, and I was lamenting that, so I went back to see if I could find the bag. And this book was with a number of other books about city planning right in the window of the gift shop. And I said, oh my gosh, I have to get that. So that was kind of fun. So in addition to our national peers, we're lucky to have some local peers joining us today. For the first block, we have Mike Thompson. He's a research fellow with the Nashville Civic Design Center. He's worked in over 20 different cities across the country, including large urban communities and in Native American reservations. Through the work that he witnessed, Through his work, he's witnessed diverse ways that cities approach design and development. And Mike joined the NCDC in January of 2016. He's created the Active Building Guidelines in collaboration with the Tennessee Department of Health and Neighborhood Assessment Toolkit. He assists with an array of NCDC projects, including the management of statewide task force on health and the built environment. So it's our hope that you have a lot of questions. It's our hope that you leave here with lots of great ideas. We're going to try to hold the questions till the end after the panelists have had some chance to make a few comments. And in this first block of films, I want to tell you that we're going to be seeing the kid's eye view, Leaving the Car Behind, Making Cities Walkable, and the Vancouver Multimodal Success Story. So we're going to see those first three. So can we start with our film? We were going to take this time to open the discussion with some panelists' reflections. maybe if you can also think about sort of the stuff that we heard was important from the last two meetings in terms of data and getting information in front of people, if you can think through that lens a little bit, or whatever other comments you might have. Now, David, you want to start?
Sure. Okay, that's on. Yeah, so I'd like to, quickly kind of sum up some of the key takeaways that I've heard from the last two pieces of this symposium that we've had. And I think, I'd start by saying a little bit about just the format that we're using, because it really does shed a lot of light on how people are really interacting with planning issues today, and just the idea that we as city planners can communicate in really succinct ways that get people to react is actually very critical, and it's a kind of important and innovative way that this whole event has really been run that I've been impressed with. I want to take a second to actually comment on the last video, because I think it highlights a couple of things that we haven't touched on quite as much thus far in the symposium. One of those pieces is having a really clear goal. And, Vancouver, I think it was Brent Tondrian kind of mentioned this, but the idea that they actually set a mode split target. They said, we're going to be shooting for 50%. And they're going to be shooting for a 50% mode split target by this event or this conference that we're going to have in 2010 or 2012. And giving your elected officials and your leaders something that they can really latch onto and that they can commit to, and then they can then go back out and say that they've done something, is really, really important. Another piece there, and this is something that I've noticed and I think is a really great opportunity for Knoxville as a city, is what bike share can do. And I've been to a couple of other cities in Tennessee that have bike share programs, and they're a tremendously important conduit to sort of building a constituency of people that understand what it's like to ride out on our streets. And that's a really important lens for people to understand often how unsafe it is to be on our streets. But it's also a way of getting people to experience their city in a very different way. And I think whether it's Vancouver or it's a smaller system in Charlotte or Nashville, it's a real opportunity here in Knoxville, and a way of also getting people to some of the smaller business districts just outside of town, and to sort of see how the city connects and how it could potentially connect in other ways. Another thing that was highlighted in the last video in particular is thinking about transportation choices and options. And ultimately, the sign of a great transportation network is the ability to walk 10 minutes or bike 5 minutes or take the bus in 8 minutes. And as mobile phones have kind of changed the interface by which we interact with our cities and how we move around them, I think that it's amazing how when I travel, that's something that really stands out, is what are the viable options that I can actually just see in a very concrete way. And some cities have them and others don't. And it's increasingly in this sort of age of Uber, we're seeing more and more that our transportation systems are able to provide a much wider range of options, and that is increasingly something that people demand, that's fueling economic development, and that's attracting people to cities around the country.
Let's see. I got one of the things that helps me in these kinds of discussions, particularly with an office of professionals, and is where the perspective that you're coming with to this. And so, how many of you are architects? And then how about landscape architects, civil engineers? Any developers?
Don't be shy.
Yeah. Urban planners, Let's see, did I say transportation planners? I can't remember.
Okay.
Traffic engineers, transportation planners. So that is helpful to see and to learn from, but part of that too was a little bit of a trick question. The urban planner question is, frankly, if you're doing anything in the built environment or related to the built environment, at some level you're an urban planner, and that is really, to me, what some of this is telling us we need to think about. And particularly those kids, because they're basically saying, hey, adults, build this urban environment for us that we want so that we can, do what we need to do and lead healthy lives. And one of the issues through my practice over the years has been that the projects that I enjoy the most and the people that I enjoy working with the most as colleagues are the people that understand that, as whether they're coming into a project as an economist or a traffic engineer, that they understand that what we're trying to do is build an urban environment that the community wants and help them find a pathway to get to that. So to me, one of the most important things for you all to take back from this and the discussions that we'll have moving forward in the session is how can you take this back and integrate it into your practice and get an understanding and a common knowledge with the colleagues that you're working with, and how you can engage the public and elected officials and the developer to deliver the communities that the kids and seniors and others really want to have and live with.
I definitely want to echo what was previously said by the two next to me, especially with the goal. I think it's really important to kind of have where are we going and to be able to answer that question well. But I think kind of with that comes, maybe this is dipping a little into kind of some of the issues and struggles that come along the way of we all in this room have a common language that we can speak around transportation, and especially the increasing research around how it affects health. Many people that we interact with, especially the public, may not speak that language. And so, as many of you have probably already come across, tensions can arise when trying to communicate, hey, this is our vision, this is our goal, where we're hoping to go, and we want your input. Like, well, wait a second, I have a car, why do I need a light rail or a bike share? And all that. So I think kind of finding ways to navigate those different languages, if you will, becomes something that we all, of course, interact with at different levels, but becomes something that always needs to be thought of and to be aware of. But two, we were joking before this about especially the first video with the kids, just, man, what more do you need to say after watching that video? Like, you don't even need us. Because it's the frankness of a kid, like, hey, adults, do something. And I think there is a lot of truth to that, of course, and I specifically like the one quote that one of the kids said where, if I'm not going to be healthy now, when am I going to be healthy? And that really resonated with me of kind of, there needs to be a focus on youth, and really at all levels, and both an acknowledgement of, but especially an empowerment of youth. And at the Nashville Civic Design Center, we actually do have a program called Citizen Planner, where we focus on kind of fostering civic mindedness and really city planning at the middle and high school level. And so we're slowly integrating with all the metro schools and private and the charter schools like that too, on creating this program. It's a 6-week program where youth come in and they're like, yeah, I mapped my neighborhood for the first time, and here's where I have sidewalks, or here I don't. And elected officials are coming to speak, to hear these presentations. And again, getting back to the language, there's kind of now we're starting to create a common language, and that's through the empowerment of youth, and now we're able to communicate better while kind of giving voice to all people. But I think too, kind of the last comment, and then we'll can open it up. But I think the idea of it doesn't happen right away, right? And everybody, including myself, originally from Minneapolis, which has pretty comprehensive public transportation, and now moving to Nashville, which we're getting there. We're getting there. Like, well, I want these things now. Like, we have to do this. Let's go. But for many reasons, which again we all experience to varying degrees, it just takes time. From funding to that language piece to just where do we put it and what do we do. And so I think the idea of phased implementations, and hopefully we'll talk some about the tactical urbanism that came up in Vancouver, and there's so many creative ways that we can go about addressing transportation that, but again, realizing phased implementations, at least that it takes time. And with Vancouver, there were several kind of catalysts that build into their kind of now world-renowned and nationally renowned transportation too.
Thank you. Well, do we want to go to the audience and take some questions, or do the panelists have anything else they want to add in terms of some of this? I mean, one thing I was thinking during the movie, and just thinking back to the public involvement side, is some of the opportunities where they were, going out and painting parts of the street different colors, and having a sign, what do you think of this in your city? Or I forget exactly what the question was, but just using all these little opportunities to try to get people engaged. And the Startup City book talks a lot about pilot projects, and it is sometimes as simple as painting the pavement of a road a different color for a little while to see what happens, and grow from there. But I don't know if you guys, again, trying to get back to the idea of examples of where you get data, or how if your pilot's working, or whatever. I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on that. And I think, this is a theme that's come up again and again over the course of our conversations in the symposium, is the idea of seeing our streets as something that they're malleable, and that they can change, and that our curbs are not set in stone, and using pilot projects and experimentation as a way to not only prove a concept without necessarily building out a full project, but also of building a constituency of people that support and defend a public space, or defend a safer street. In some of the work that I've done, not only in New York City, but in working through NACTO with cities around the country, I think what I've found interesting is that can take multiple forms. In New York City, we looked at actually managing a street just by time of day. So when the kids, a street next to a school would close every day at 3 o'clock, and would be kind of activated for a few hours, and then it would reopen to traffic. And actually, play streets are something that many cities have longstanding programs in. Neighborhoods have longstanding block parties. Sometimes one of the most interesting things is, and we were working with a partner in Memphis, that those block parties have kind of evolved into opportunities to test different kinds of designs on our streets, to see what a protected bike lane might look like, to look at the dimensions of a bioswale or a shorter crosswalk. And that goes all the way to larger kind of pilots and transformations, like what New York City did at Times Square, or some of the amazing work that was done as part of San Francisco's Pavement to Parks and Parklets programs, parklets being these sort of little platforms extending the sidewalk. To your point about measurement, I think that one of the ways that I've seen cities be really successful is taking a kind of fine-grained engineering approach to these kinds of pilots, so that it's not just a fun event, but they're actually looking at and collecting responses, not only qualitative, but sometimes quantitative responses, to understand, is traffic going slower? What are is there any kind of mode shift that we're seeing on this particular corridor over the course of a year? New York did a great report that kind of provides a valuable template for this analysis, called Measuring the Streets, where they were looking at corridors that they had transformed next to those that they hadn't, that had very similar kind of characteristics, land use and transportation wise. So, there's incredible expertise and knowledge that's sort of been built up in the last 5 years in this arena. And I think that Knoxville's in a great position with a strong downtown to learn from that and leverage it.
Thank you. Well, go to the audience and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay. You'll get your after lunch exercise running around.
Thank you. Living in suburbia, I talked to you guys this morning, we have the complexity of that we're always going to have a car-dependent society. It's just kind of part of the nature, and we're going to have to adjust for that. we have some major intersections in our town, 6 lanes wide. How do you make that walking friendly?
Phil laughed first, so.
Yeah, I left first, so I get to take this. And I've worked in a number of communities around this issue. I mean, one answer to that is that if you're following the regulations and related to the Americans with Disabilities Act, you do actually have to design the signals so that it provides adequate walking time, and in fact the walking speed has recently been decreased. And so you just at that basic sort of very functional level. One of the things that we found through some design studies that we'd done, and then unfortunately in this case we were able to convince the state transportation agency, Caltrans, that it made sense on El Camino Real, which is an old state highway in the Bay Area that runs from San Francisco all the way down and through San Jose. So it's a very long old state highway that's an arterial street that has many downtowns along it. That they wanted to be protective of the vehicle throughput of the street, but through the analysis that was done for a project we did for the city of Palo Alto, we were able to show that there were portions of the street that they could do a road diet on and take it from 6 to 4 lanes. We were doing level of service kind of an analysis as part of the project, and it was already doing so poorly. We were basically trying to make it, perform at least at the level that it was at 20 years into the future. But what we found in doing this was in some of these 4-lane sections, we could actually improve the flow of the traffic a little bit because we were able to shorten the walk time on the signal. A good portion of the intersection congestion was caused by the fact that the pedestrians had to walk such a long distance in order for the signal to continue going through its cycle. And Caltrans didn't believe it at first, but they did. There was full analysis that was done for the whole corridor. Unfortunately, what ended up happening, and this is another issue that we could get into, is this whole thing about recently the idea of alternative facts has become kind of a new thing. In the public dialogue, it's been there for quite a while. And the level of access to information on the internet and maybe not understanding some of the information that you're getting. So the public was nervous about it. Well, no, we can't, and there's so much traffic on that street, we can't do it, we're going to get cut through traffic, and the political will wasn't quite there, but we actually had Caltrans agreeing to do it, and they wouldn't do it. But the design of the intersections for pedestrians, again, is just a key issue. We've gone through iterations of work that we've done in suburban development and suburban projects to design the medians to be wide enough and more comfortable so that pedestrians can be in the middle of the street when the signal changes. That's a big debate issue about whether that's the right thing to do or not. But the fact is that people get stranded there even if you're trying to time the signal so that they don't. In that Palo Alto project, one of the people on our community panel talked about how she had to stop her car in the middle of the street to pick up a senior citizen to help her be able to cross the rest of the street. So there's a lot of details in that. But I would say in the suburban environment, I think there is this idea that we're not going to be able to affect enough change. And I understand that, I think it's next week, there's a session that's going to be happening here about converting suburbia. And while it's true there's always going to be use of the automobile in suburbia, I think dependency might not be the right way to think about it. I think like these kids were asking for, I think there are already people out there who can't drive and we need to design suburbia to allow those people to function more fully.
Well, do you, any of you guys have some thoughts about also in terms of things like road diets or intersection improvements that are more multimodal and benefits to the surrounding, like retail or whatever, getting to something I think Bill or someone else has brought up a couple times in terms of, you know, if it can't be done because of the traffic numbers or some other very hard metric, is there another hook?
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think, you know, there are streets around the country that we can look to as examples of this, whether they're, you know, even in New York City, people don't tend to think of New York City as a place that has, you know, huge 6-lane roads that people are struggling to cross. But there are those roads, and they have made pedestrian safety improvements that have vastly improved some of those walking experiences, even in conditions where, you know, the traffic is going to be what you would see on a major highway in most places. You know, at the same time, I think that, you know, when I was working with NACTO on their urban street design guide, the question would come up, well, what about our suburban environments, or what about rural environments? How does this apply? And oftentimes I would respond to that question by saying, we're still humans. We don't walk faster or slower in a suburb. You know, if we think about the kind of language of traffic engineering, which often thinks about what your base design vehicle is, the human as a design vehicle for how we're thinking about our roadways is one that walks a certain pace, that gets impatient to cross the street after 300 feet. These are baseline kind of ways in which we're interacting with our environment, and we should find ways not necessarily to turn a suburban area into New York City, but to accommodate the desire lines that we have to get from, you know, to get to a business that's really midway between a crosswalk that probably is, you know, 1,000 or 1,200 feet apart. One of the good things that I think we've seen more recently is that there are now tools that allow us to not necessarily have crosswalks every 300 feet in a suburban environment, but, you know, actuated signals or hawk signals that, very boring traffic engineering terms, but they are tools that allow us to achieve something in the middle and that can accommodate movements that we want to see and that people want to make without putting themselves in danger. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to real safety problems. And, you know, the work that New York City's been doing around Vision Zero, and not trying to discourage pedestrians by removing crosswalks where there's an unsignalized intersection, but facilitating those with the tools that we have and that we can use. And I think that that's a change from, you know, a decade ago when those weren't necessarily being used around the country.
Mike, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just one thing I want to throw on that too, and of course I want to echo what they both said about, I hope no one enters into kind of the suburban reconfiguring, or however we call this, with the suburbs are lost. Like, we're just never going to get them to be kind of multimodal. Because I think even things like park and ride and bus stuff like that, there's you know, really cool opportunities, especially in the suburbs like that, when, hey, everyone's coming down to downtown Knoxville, here's a parking lot where we can all meet, and then that cuts down cars right there. But I know as well some work that I'm doing with the State Health Department on an inventory of case studies on health and built environment stuff. And TDOT's Community Planning Transportation Grants actually provided money to rural communities, arguably even more car dependent. And a lot of stuff that they did with that is, I mean, corridor studies with resulting recommendations of what if we put bike lanes in some of these rural county roads and had more pedestrian sidewalk space with landscaping and all that too. So kind of looking, I guess, creatively for funds. And obviously that's a whole topic by itself, the funding piece. But realizing that there are still things that we can do, and especially with corridor studies, that dips into a little the data pieces too that we've mentioned, how looking at, I mean, the safety aspect and how many cars and pedestrians and all that too. So there's definitely stuff out there. I hope we don't give up on suburbs.
Phil, do you have any other tidbits?
Well, this is probably a bit getting into some of what the next set of documentaries is going to be about, but part of the suburb discussion is definitely a land use discussion. And we've been talking some in sort of side discussions about issues about, well, why, when you're out there, and why doesn't this property provide access to the adjacent property, even if it's for vehicles? Because one of the problems with the hierarchical road system that the suburbs use is that when you're in those retail areas and it is a car-focused thing, and you may even be driving from one store in a shopping center to a store in the same shopping center, but then if you want to drive to the next shopping center, you have to go back out to the arterial street. So we're putting more traffic out there than needs to be out there. If we could have those interconnections on the sides and have a little bit more of a grid, we could take some of the pressure off of the arterial street and maybe be able to do some road dieting, or be able to deal with signal progressions that might allow you to have more crossings. So there are those kinds of issues that are out there where it really is where the land use and the transportation are coming together, and it's making it quite challenging.
All right, do we have some more questions? Yes.
So for us, so large intersections, to be honest, I think, not to sound competitive, we're probably the opposite issues that we have. I'm originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I drove my car once in a 5-year program. I mean, I had models, balanced on my bike and bags and brains. So I'm an avid biker. I've been here for 10 years, and I've ridden my bike to work 4 times. And I say that honestly because the first time I did, I almost had a heart attack. Ironically enough, not to sound like the devil's advocate, but we have a reason for suburbia, and it's terrain. So I'm kind of specifically asking you from Oakland, what can we do to get more people like me that want to engage with the greenways, but there might be some components here or there that are making it pretty much impossible, despite the desire, the will to travel in the right way. And by the way, another part of that same conversation is, when the regulations combat the feasibility of that route. For instance, we are now looking at, in our local area, a lot more off-road greenways, because that allows us for a narrower footprints in grade, fewer trees removed. That said, you're moving a lot left. So right, you're touching more properties. You're not following the slopes of roadways, so it's just not feasible. So I'm pass that on.
Okay, I'm not sure I totally am understanding the direction you're coming from in the question. I mean, you have to deal with the terrain, and having seen what was happening with with bicycle planning and infrastructure as it's evolved in San Francisco, that was a lot of the debate. Is the city did a comprehensive bicycle network, and there were problems with the environmental law in California that slowed them down. But a lot of the pushback from others in the community was like, "What in the world are you talking about? Haven't you looked at the terrain?" And they've moved forward. A lot of the bike facilities are being implemented, and they are seeing an increase in bicycle use, and an amazing increase in bicycle use. And there's been debate around some of the streets that are the streets where you can avoid some of the terrain. And the debate there has become between transit and bike, because those are also the streets that it's a lot easier for the buses to move on at a more reasonable speed, and having a dependable progression down the street. And so you get sort of the fight within the limited right-of-way. And I'm not sure if that's some of what you were talking about. But that is, a real challenge. And we've done some work recently in Alameda County around this whole issue of, there has become a strong commitment to building complete streets and being multimodal. There's actually a requirement in order for local governments to get funding that comes from the congestion management agency that they have to have complete streets, at least policies in place, and over time they're going to be required to have complete streets guidelines. And the congestion management agency gets a big chunk of their funding through a local option sales tax. And increasingly over time, as they've gone back for reauthorizations, it's become more and more important for that to be multimodal. And they realize that they can't spend it all on vehicle-oriented things, and the freeway system is pretty much built out, so they needed to really analyze what to do with the arterial streets. So we did a comprehensive analysis of the entire county's arterial street system, and looking at where are the transit priorities, where are the bike priorities, where are the pedestrian priorities, the vehicle and goods movement, and doing analysis looking at land use, travel patterns, and all of these sorts of things, and coming up with a priority system that now the congestion management agency will be able to use as a measure for evaluating projects that locals propose to them. There's also a set of multimodal performance measures that will be used. And so that creates a set of information that's affecting the funding stream so that projects need to be designed and work out. Some of this always ends up being the detail of actually designing the street, because and there just is a point in a limited right-of-way where the community has to have that hard discussion about what the priorities are. But I think there's a methodology that's evolving to help get at these kinds of issues so that we can find a system that works. And one of the breakthroughs of this work that we did as well is that it looks at the network and sort of acknowledges that we're not going to be able to have, the top priorities that it may make sense in an initial look that everything needs to be a top priority on this street. We're not going to be able to do that. So where within the network can we serve that mode so that we have a functional multimodal network? So there's a lot of new work coming out, things with data that is being gathered in a way that we never could before, so that you understand where cyclists are and can analyze where they might be able to function better. So there's just a whole lot of new information, but we need to change the way that we're doing our planning and the way that we're thinking about things to be able to balance those modes.
And we have a question here in the...
Just an answer to your question.
Use this so that we'll be recorded.
I put mountain bike gearing on my road bike, and it's been heaven. Also, the electric bikes are starting to come out. They're too expensive right now, but I rather think it will go down in price. So I understand what you're saying. Oofta, we've got the hills, but there are some technological alternatives to look at.
Great. We might have time for one more question, or we could have, is there any other thoughts you guys would like to offer? I don't want to stand between the break. I'm sorry, Diane.
I must have looked at hundreds and hundreds of videos to come up with the ones that were here. And I found several from Scandinavian countries about cycling, and they have really high usage for bicycling in extreme environments. And so I just kind of want to put that out there, that some of it is mindset. I think that's what, a few people have touched on. Willingness, mindset, adaptability. And the more you can do that, the comments about creating the environment that creates the conditions for it, but goodness, if those countries can cycle during the winter in that kind of environment, it's something that is pretty inspirational.
Well, there's also an issue that particularly around bicycling, that there's some cultural issues, and the way that bicycling has evolved in the United States is quite different than what has been happening in the European countries. And I'm an example of this myself in the way that I grew up and the way that I got into bicycling. I don't quite have the time that I used to have, and I'm not one of the Lycra crowd, at least for the past few years. But that is one of the challenges that's there. So the discussion that's been happening around the European example has really led to a lot of discussion about this sort of family-friendly network of streets and the idea that we need to design the bike network to support people who are going to ride slower, to support kids, and that's led to talking about cycle track, where you're fully separated, but still within the street, but fully separated from the traffic. And this has come to a head in my community where I live in Berkeley, which has a very high cycle mode split and actually has a pretty high pedestrian mode split. And the planning that was done, they hadn't updated the bicycle plan for about 7 years, and things have changed remarkably since then. And one of the ideas of the plan, Berkeley has a very good bike boulevard network. The idea that off of the arterial street, we're going to have these cycling streets that are going to be slower, and they'll have some of that family-friendly character to it. Well, people got involved in the plan and said, well, that's all well and good, and it's good that you're going to deal with the arterial road crossings, but the retail is on the arterial, and I want to be able to safely cycle with my kid to the retail. And we have space in these streets. We need to be doing cycle track on these streets. And the plan was published with, the draft was published with a lot of cycle tracks indicated on most of the major arterials. The transit agency had some issues with this and got vocal about it because they want to put bus rapid transit on a lot of those streets. So you're getting into the battle of the right-of-way. But that was going to sort of evolve and let itself work out. And in the last month, a group of the Lycra crowd got together and got really upset and went to the transportation department and to some of the council members and said, this isn't going to work. We don't want to ride with those slow cyclists in the cycle track. And you're going to redesign these streets so that we can't ride at the speed that we want to ride at. And it's part of it is that cultural thing. And I find it even when I bike commute that, it's a bit of exercise that I'm doing and I want to ride fast. But in the European model, and I've gone and toured over there and been toured around by cycling officials, and they're like, we don't understand what's up with you people. You need to learn to ride in the non-sweat zone. You need to be willing to amble when you're on a bicycle. And I think some of those kinds of things, this is a big cultural shift that is potentially happening, and those things are going to have to be worked out. And electric bicycling is a part of that, but then as a cyclist, I've almost been run over by people on electric bikes. So there's some cultural things about the way that we think about transportation that we still need to work through. And one of the things I think that is going to be helpful in that is the discussion around Vision Zero and bringing safety into these discussions, because one of the biggest factors of safety in these urban areas is speed. And we really need to change the way that our culture deals with speed and our desire to do things quickly. Sorry, that was sort of a long...
Okay, Mike.
I'll make this real quick. First of all, I've never been in the no sweat zone, so we'll talk about that later. But I think really the cultural shift, especially in the Southeast here, we have such a normative culture of a sedentary lifestyle, right? Where it's just the norm to use your car, to not be as active engaged. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think the topography issue is a great one that I personally, same thing for me, as well as the summer heat and all those things too. But I think one of the ways that we can potentially address this, one, education, of course. I mean, that's usually a first step. But also just thinking about accessibility of transportation, and really for all people, not just, kind of, I'll leave it at that, but really for all people. The commissioner for the state health department has a phrase, make the healthy choice the easy choice. And I think we can apply that mentality to transit hopefully as well, of really make the transit choice also healthy, but make the transit choice the easy choice, and also when people realize it's usually the cheaper choice too. And so when you kind of tie in this education, then especially the accessibility, people are much more likely, myself included, to choose the easier choice. If it's easier to take light rail or a bike share or whatever, I'm probably going to do that, especially if it saves me money. So,
Thank you. Well, I think we're up against our ending time. We will have another discussion after a short break, a 10-minute break. 10 minutes is what we had it scheduled for, so we'll stick with that. I want to give a big round of applause to Mike and Phil and David. Thank you, guys. I'm going to see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you for coming back. For our second block of documentaries, we're going to have two new local panelists join Philip and David. Let me introduce them, and then I'll introduce the documentaries that we're going to look at. So Gerald Green is the Executive Director of the Knox County Metropolitan Planning Commission. Gerald has served as Principal Planner for the East Tennessee Development District, Senior and Chief Planner for the City of Asheville, North Carolina, as well as he's been in private practice as the owner of InFocus Planning and Design, also in Asheville. And prior to coming to Knoxville in 2015, he was the Planning Director of Jackson County, North Carolina. Andy Powers, at the end, is the Director of Design Services for the University of Tennessee Facilities Services. It said UT graduate, so I figured that meant University of Tennessee, but figured you guys would know that. Well, yes. Anyway, so I figured you guys would know that. Andy's worked in a number of local Knoxville design firms with much of his career as an architect focused on UT projects. Andy's worked on nearly 30 projects at UT, leading the office's professional design advice on campus aesthetics, technical details, and master plans. So, as we get ready for the second block of documentaries, we are thinking about land use and zoning and some of those other issues, as we hope to focus on those. The three documentaries are City Planners versus Architects, a fairly famous Seinfeld episode, or a clip from a fairly famous Seinfeld episode. We're going to hear from how Donald Shoup will find you a parking spot. And last but not least, we're going to show the zoning and walkability, which is City Council member Marshall Starr, a local Knoxville star. I don't think he's doing it live this time, but he did earlier this morning. So those are our second set of documentaries, and I'll ask you to get started on those. All right. Well, hopefully our panelists got some thoughts that maybe they could let us hear in terms of these land use and zoning changes, and how this audience in particular maybe can contribute to making some of these decisions easier, implementing these changes easier.
This time around, I read the questions we were supposed to think about before I spoke, and one of those was, what were the obstacles? I read the questions we were supposed to think about before we responded or said something, and one of those, what are the obstacles to changing our zoning code? I'd like to speak to two. One of those is the inability of most people to envision what something could look like. They accept what we have. I know all of us in this room spend our many wakeless nights thinking about how the city could look, as opposed to thinking about how we get from one place to the other. But we don't have many, well, I have to be cautious saying this, but I'll say we don't have many good examples in Knoxville that were built in the last 40 or 50 years. We look at old neighborhoods, look at central, downtown, and those are the things we're trying to recreate. I talked to my staff and said, we're working a lot to try to make Knoxville what it was like 100 years ago without standards, and it's challenging. And we've talked in some of these sessions about taking small steps, and I think small steps, do things in your neighborhood. In my neighborhood in the fall, last year was the first year I was there, but we put sawhorses up at the end, each end of a street, and have a block party. We don't ask anyone. We put the sawhorses up, say the street's closed, and people come out. And then those same people start coming out more often and see that the street can be used for something other than traffic. So, and there are many other instances. Our Board of Zoning Appeals is granting variances to reduce the number of parking spaces. So the old co-op does not need 59 spaces, to see if that works. And that gives us ability to change our parking ordinance to reduce the minimum, to place a maximum. Do small steps, envision what things could look like, as opposed to accepting the way they are now. The next thing is that this is a multi-jurisdictional challenge. We have lots of players in this, and I'll speak of one issue and briefly talk about another one. We're spending $300 million to, quote, improve Alcoa Highway. What are we improving? We're improving the ability of people not to live in the community where they work and not to work in the community where they live. We're improving the ability of internal combustion engines to decrease the quality of our air. We're increasing the ability of people to spend time in their automobile rather than at PTA meetings or coaching Little League or other things. So what are we improving? And we let that happen. You know, and I'll point to FHA, TDOT, TPO, our elected officials, the people who drive on that road who want to get from here to there faster because they don't want to live here and work here in the same place. And there are other challenges too, I understand, in that with two working spouses, that they work in different places, or partners, whatever we call them, that they work in different places and they can't always live in the same community. But there has to be, we'll never get transit between Alcoa and Maryville and Knoxville if we keep making it easy to drive a private automobile. The other one I'll hint at is just Broadway and 640. I live just north of 640. I live 6 miles from work and I can't ride my bike to work because I've killed too many guardian angels. I had motorcycles when I was in my 20s. I've ridden bikes and done trail running since then. So I don't want to take the chance. And we've allowed that quote, improvement to happen without accommodating thoroughly pedestrians and bicyclists. We need a different approach to things. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gerald. David?
I love that the Seinfeld clip was played, first of all. And I think I will start there. I'm going to go there. But I think it touches on, and especially in a group of planners, architects, and landscape architects, a lot of us, I think, came into this profession and got interested in cities because we had that kind of leap of thinking, I don't really just want to design a building. I want to design a city. And as anyone who's been shamed at an architecture critique knows, it's not as bad as being shamed at a public meeting. And I think that actually really does speak to the difference between the two professions, and that even though there's a shared lineage there, ultimately planning and the sort of large-scale redesigning of our communities does answer to the public, and the public is the ultimate expert. Now, at the same time, as someone who has a fascination with urban history, I understand that city design, and especially sort of reconfiguring cities in a dramatic way and the sort of modernization and improvement projects of yesterday, still actually bear a lot of influence on how our cities are shaped and how they're made up. And, parking, to connect Donald Shoup's comment, was a big part of that. 1920s to the 1940s, downtown department stores, as people started moving away, they freaked out. And they found every small, decrepit building that they could, or the street over from the main street, and they tore it down, and they made parking, and they consolidated parking behind Gay Street, and they re-envision their cities to compete with suburban malls that were offering free parking. And actually, interestingly enough, parking was a kind of very interesting part of architecture for a long time. New Haven, Connecticut has this incredibly strange but beautiful parking garage designed by Paul Rudolph that was done in the 1970s. So I think that we're at an interesting point now, especially with the kind of advent of new technologies in smart city, where actually the idea of kind of reconceptualizing our cities and thinking big has come back at the same moment that we're actually thinking small, and we're thinking about our cities at a human scale and trying to recapture the parts of our cities that were designed in a pre-automobile age. And if we look at the historical precedents that inform our current codes, and in some ways the kind of chutzpah that went into that design language, and we take that same kind of daring to the rethinking and the updating of our zoning codes, I think that there's a tremendous role and a tremendous partnership that can happen between city planners and architects, once again, and that there's an opportunity to help people visualize and really kind of spatialize the ideas that they have, the things that, in the first video of kids, trying to understand how they can make a community park better, or how they can cross the street more easily, and communicating those into the kind of codes and standards and DNA that's going to inform how we design our city for the next 50 years.
Kind of building off of that, I think being trained as an architect and practiced as an architect, but then also being an urban planner and city planner at this point, I think one of the things to me that's frustrating about this is that a piece of architecture practice that seems to have been lost is this recognition of the building as the framer of public space. And part of what has fed into that and some of the problems with the suburban pattern of development is the loss of understanding that the street is public space. And when you look at most cities in the United States, somewhere around 25-30% of the land area is street. And we've given the majority of it spatially and certainly functionally over to the vehicle. And we aren't allowing that social life and pedestrian life to happen there. And the architecture is not making a contribution to that. Now, some of that is because the city planners and the public and elected officials and planning commissioners weren't asking for that for a long period of time. But now we're finding that we are doing that, and that is being asked. And I think one of the things here locally, as this zoning proposal that the change that the city is going to be looking at moves forward, I think it's really becomes important for those of you in the architecture profession and landscape architecture and people that work with the development community is to help translate what the community and the city planners are trying to do in terms of building the city and re-envisioning the city to the developers that you work with, but also helping the public understand what these zoning changes are about. There was discussion in the meeting it's gone by really fast, last night, that was probably the most emotional part of the discussions that have happened, where one resident of the area who was new to the area was expressing frustration and figuring out how to engage in the public discussions around transportation and land use planning. And then there was a longtime resident who was expressing a lot of frustration about having tried to engage and finding herself to be totally ineffective until she took it upon herself to, in her community, to sort of do guerrilla kinds of improvements. But I think the professional organizations, the university, the community design center, there's an opportunity for the profession to step into this and help illustrate and serve as translator visually about why these changes are being proposed and why they're important. There's many more models now to point at than there used to be around the country, say 10, 15 years ago, to get past these issues that we're not talking about changing the zoning to get at architectural style necessarily. We're talking about changing the zoning so that we're getting buildings that contribute to public space again, that help create these walkable environments. Go ahead and be modernist. Go ahead and be like that new brewery on the north side of town that's using concrete block to try and look like a castle. Do that if you're doing these things that we want to make in terms of the way the city is going to function. So I think for those of you in this room and what you do, that is a really important role that you can play.
Okay, so I heard a lot of interesting things here today, and I too will go where Seinfeld treaded. My background's kind of interesting. And I think the whole architectural versus city planner thing's a really interesting discussion to me. I think the architects, I'm a trained architect, and architects have a sort of a responsibility for a civic vision, I think. And I believe most of the people take that very seriously, but I think it can easily get lost in the compromises of a project. And so, once upon a time, I was an intern at the Community Design Center, for those of you who've been around a long time, when Annette was over there. And we did a streetscape project up in Gatlinburg, and we dealt a lot with parking and walkability and signalization and safety. It's really interesting to me. That was, back in the dark ages of, 1980-ish or so. But it's funny to me when I see now which of those simple things are still applicable as they were then. So it's not rocket science. There have been a lot of improvements and a lot of interesting developments, but I do think that generically, as a collective profession, we know and understand what these issues are. It's a matter of really getting our voice heard as designers. And so to me, working at the university, I'm sort of a poor man's planner, I guess, at this point. At one time, I worked for the city of Raleigh in the downtown historic planning department, and now as the university's architect, we don't have a professional planner on staff. It's something I'm really interested in. But we're constantly trying to engage our administration and sort of teach them. We have some great landscape architects on our staff and some terrific professionals that help us try to educate the administration. So I think if you translate that out to the city, there's a couple of lessons to be learned, and y'all touched on it in your last talk that made a lot of sense to me. And that's, you're talking about a vision. And I think at the University of Tennessee, there is a vision. There's a lot of problems with some of the vision, but it's sort of a series of compromises, as many things in the public sector are. But there is a big vision to connect the buildings, to sort of brand the buildings in one thing, and also to lace them together with the built environment, and to get intermodal transportation. We're pushing the parking to the perimeter. We are making totally walkable streets where there are no vehicles that are. We're slowing down traffic, landscaping, and making spaces where cars and people and so on can all interact. So I was really struck by something you just said a second ago about the public is the expert. So I wrote that down in my notes here. But And to a large degree, I think that's really true. I thought the kids' video was awesome because I thought out of the mouths of babes, they say. And I thought there was a lot of interesting things. But then again, I think as a designer, as an architect, a landscape architect, city planner, part of your job is to, and Bill Schell taught me this, Doug, you'll love this, but Bill Schell taught me when I was getting wiped out in a design crit one day, that the architect's responsibility is to take that vision and push it and educate. So I think while the public is sort of the ultimate expert, we're the experts that help guide them and push them into new things. And so and I would sort of chide some of our architects. I cut my teeth, most of my career was at an landscape architectural firm, and the privilege of working on a lot of the greatest spaces in Knoxville and a few in Nashville and Chattanooga. Very memorable spaces with Mike Fowler, who this thing's excellent. And I would sort of chide our architects to utilize the expertise of landscape architects and planners a little bit more. And I think that would go a long ways to assisting. So I'll shut up for a bit.
David, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to respond to one thing, and I think one of the kind of often overlooked parts of this question of the continuum between architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning is the role of engineers and civil engineers. And at a municipal level, it's often, it can be a really significant hurdle to translate not only architectural or landscape architectural ideas to an engineering audience, but also planning ideas. And I think that, when I was working with NACTO and through the urban street design guide that we did, that was a critical part of our conversation, working with state DOTs and the FHWA, of trying to understand how engineers think, which is a very different professional language and a different professional domain, and one that in most cities in the country is someone that's essentially going to be delivering most of the public works and infrastructure that we're talking about today. So it's a critical part of the sort of municipal government fabric that often gets left out of that debate, but one that I think there's a real appetite, especially among young engineers, to embrace a new way of thinking about their environment.
Cheryl, do you want to add
Two
something?
quick comments. One, the statement Andy made about the vision for UT, I think it's a great vision. Having gone to graduate school there, there seemed to be a lack of vision in seeing the changes. The city also has a vision that the mayor has put forth and that NPC staff are trying to implement with the help of the community with the zoning code up that date. That's to take the revitalization of downtown and extend it along the corridors and then to the adjacent neighborhoods while protecting the character of those neighborhoods. That's a tall task, and this is where I'll pick up on something that Philip said, that we need the assistance of the community in helping others envision that. It's tough to envision driving down Magnolia Avenue, what it could look like, what it looked like at one point, and what it could look like again. So we need that help. And when I had my own firm, it was a planning and landscape architecture firm, and it was amazing how we could sell almost any idea with a pretty picture. And we need realistic pictures. We're not trying to sell an idea, we're trying to sell that vision of what our city could be in the next 50 years. And we've got some significant challenges here with the population growth that is anticipated, other changes that will come with what will driverless cars do to us, what will new thoughts and approaches to working do to us. So we've got significant changes, and having your assistance as design professionals to help people envision what those changes could be would be great.
Well, maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Does anybody have questions? Wayne's got the microphone. No question. Okay, there's one in the front.
Just in thinking about the difference between interest or competing interests between walkability and affordable housing, and how you see that play out developers saying maybe that they can do one or the other, but not both.
Well, and that's come up before as well, and I think we're talking with Jeff and other people this afternoon, that's come up, and I had, as I said before I came here, Knoxville was coming up on a lot of new publications were coming out, and I don't think Knoxville came up in this context, but the winter 2017 National Association of Realtors have a report called On Common Ground, where they're really advocating a lot of the things that we're talking about. So not totally what maybe you're exactly your answer, but I wanted to mention that just based on some other conversations I've had today and yesterday. So, Philip?
That is so frustrating and not true. And it's, in some ways it's bizarre to me through recent filters of recent meetings that I've been at, where there's some of the way that we pay for public infrastructure and encourage affordable housing and transit-oriented development in California now is through the money that's generated from the carbon GHG process that California has put into place. And I was just at a meeting the other day when a woman from the Smart Growth Council in Sacramento, which is a multi-agency group that's generating the funding grants for what to do with this money, was talking about a new program that they have that is working at providing grants to communities to do walkable infrastructure around affordable housing projects so that the people in the affordable housing can get to transit. There's just the disconnect in the understanding of saying something like that, that if you're trying to make a really affordable community, that, and this is, and it's the developer's lens, and I get that, but for the household, it's not just the housing cost, it's the transportation cost. So great, you're giving me a house that I can afford to buy, but then my household is going to have at least 2 cars, and I'm going to be driving long distances and not being able to, it's such a dysfunctional kind of approach. And I think it's something where the public sector just has to be insistent that for the public good and for true affordability, we just can't allow this to keep happening in these developments. It has to be walkable. Now, let's get into the discussion about what's the engineering for the road? How is the sidewalk designed so that it can be more affordably constructed, more affordably maintained, and get into all of those kinds of discussions. But being able to safely walk from my home to even just to my neighbor's home needs to be a right.
And I think what's going on down in the strip area around UT and Fort Sanders and the sort of north edge of campus is starting to speak to that to some degree in Knoxville. Our students obviously need, and young professionals need affordable housing and ways to walk around. And I think the city's sort of first foray into that is a pretty good shot. I wish the form-based zoning was a little tighter down there. I think they're trying to address that now as well. But I think it was a pretty good shot, and I think the way the university, we're sort of reacting with that quarter by adjusting some of our residential properties on that end of campus. Some of the current and future stuff we're putting there reacts to that corridor. And I think a great example, part of what we're talking about here is a culture of sort of putting your money where your mouth is. And I think, the university, we have some advantages. We charge for parking, so, it's kind of laughing listening to that video. So we understand the value of collecting revenue, but that revenue is spent on parking and roads and things, so it goes back to what is being created from it. And I guess I was surprised moving from the private sector to the public sector, how the students are willing to pay for certain things that they believe in. We have all kinds of fees. We have technology fees and athletic fees and all kinds of things, and they're thrust upon them. But the things that the students will fund come out of something we call the green fee. And they put the money in, and then they get to decide where it is spent. So I think some of this stuff is a cultural shift, and I think the younger generation maybe is willing to put their money where their mouth is, and we all need to do that. And I just wanted to mention, I think the city and the university are trying to really communicate and partner together. And I think there's a lot of examples of it, but I think one really good example that sort of relates to what we're talking about today is the Lake Avenue Garage, which we're constructing right now. It's pushed to the edge of our campus, which coincidentally is on the south side of Cumberland. And so when we got together with the city early in the design stage, and we have come up with a shared relationship where the university owns the garage, but the city's actually leasing those spaces after 5 o'clock. And they'll be much like the garages downtown, so they'll be free. So I think it's that kind of cooperation that'll help start that sort of.
Yeah, and one other piece to add to that, I think that we now have seen a number of cities, I've mentioned Charlotte a few times, that have really overhauled their regulations and their zoning code to ensure that basic human rights for people that walk or bike are really protected. And I think that that's an opportunity when the zoning code is being looked at again, and there's a kind of policy window to ensure that those safeguards are in place. That is why our municipal government exists. That's why zoning came about, to protect through the police power and create basic thresholds for these developments, and sidewalks, I think, are part of that. And there's cultural barriers to that, especially in places where people don't walk, and I can understand how that can get swept into the affordability conversation. But I think that for a responsible public servant, that's a place to put your energy.
I'd like to address just a little bit what Andy was talking about earlier about teamwork and working with other design professionals. We as the architects are many times on the building projects are the lead design professional, but I think a lot of what our responsibility is there are a lot of other design professionals on the project, civil engineers, planners, landscape architect, lab experts on some of these very complicated buildings. And a lot of our main responsibility on the project is to be sure that the professionals that have expertise that you don't have are at the table at the right time. In the past, a lot of the projects, you mentioned UT back 25 years ago, is more the architect had the vision, they sort of designed the building, and then the civil engineer, the landscape architect was called in to implement certain pieces, and that's one reason the buildings probably didn't relate that well together and those kind of things. So I think it's very important that the architect understands that maybe they're the prime on the project, but they need to respect the design professionals that are on their team and the client who has a lot of experts within their team that if you don't get buy-in from them and their input, then it's not going to be the right building or the right site for the project.
Do you have any more questions? There's one in the back, a gentleman.
Well, while that's going back, I might echo that. I mean, there's I've over the years have developed similar relationships, like through street design projects that I do. A lot of the work that we do now is around complete street design, and it's interesting now that I have relationships with a set of transportation consultants and in relationship with a set of civil engineers that will get in touch with each other as new RFPs are coming out. And one of the first things we do is have a discussion of, okay, how can we work on this together and get this job? Given this client, it means the transportation engineer needs to be the lead on this one. And then on another project, it might be, well, it's a civil engineer. And so a flexibility around that in terms of urban design and street design to sort of deal with the face of the client that you have to deal with and their expectations, but the way that we function as a team and work with the public and work through resolving design issues with the staff of the client is really more as an integrated team. So there's those kinds of orchestrations really need to happen in all the projects that we do that are building elements of the city.
I'm Wolf Naegeli, president of the Technical Society of Knoxville, but I need to say what I'm saying today, that's all my personal opinion. I'm very glad about this symposium yesterday and today. It's very interesting and productive in many ways, but I'm also a little bit concerned that we talk more about selling a vision or looking at examples from other larger cities, mostly particularly with regard to public transportation and intermodal examples. And we haven't really paid too much attention how that relates to the greater Knoxville area. I'm glad somebody mentioned topography, which of course is a very important thing here, and also, as was said at the podium, that climate plays a role. If we look at San Francisco or Northern Europe, the climate conditions are quite different, and with the humid and very hot climate during the summer, it makes it fairly miserable for a lot of people, and it may be okay for recreation and sports, but to think about commuting on bicycles, that's much more challenging. I'm glad Gerald mentioned the autonomous vehicles, and I think that's really something that we have not paid enough attention yet. The age of autonomous vehicles is almost upon us, and it will engulf us much sooner than most of us believe that will happen. And there, I think it's really important to think about how to shape visions rather than how to sell visions, and how to get to formulate visions that are practical and that are desirable, as opposed, just to accommodate what's going to happen, particularly with these new technologies. And there's also the other thing that's coming up between bicycles and cars, traditional cars, those small vehicles. Some are completely enclosed for a single passenger or driver, or just 2 or 3 people, which can really fill in a gap that's not being used technologically. And that also means quite a lot of challenges in terms of the road infrastructure and street scapes, of course. So there's tremendous opportunities, and there are also a lot of potential negative impacts from all these technologies. And unless we formulate, and also with the communities, we decide what we'd like to have rather than how we accommodate what's going to happen, that's extremely important.
Well, Wolf, I think everyone's going to think you're a plant, and that Jeff and I don't need to even go to the third documentary set, but we're going to. So please stick around, because Wolf's raising some of the same issues and opportunities that we're going to talk about in this last set of it's not even a set of documentaries, it's one documentary, but is there any last thoughts? We're kind of wrap up.
I'd just like to respond. While we use other cities as examples, and we can learn a lot from other cities and what other jurisdictions have done, we've done a lot of planning in Knoxville for Knoxville, whether that's our overall comprehensive plan or our corridor plans or our neighborhood plans. We have a vision that was crafted in Knoxville for Knoxville. We have to do a better job of letting the community know what that vision is because they forget, and MPC hasn't done a good job of implementing those visions. We've let the plans sit on the shelves too long, and we're starting to move them off, and we have some great staff to do that. With regard to autonomous vehicles, the mayor has already challenged the staff with thinking about autonomous vehicles and giving us the direction that we need to shape, let our vision for the community shape how autonomous vehicles are used in this community. You know, I had some days I'm still idealistic, and I thought there'd be no parking lots, all the parking garages would be turned to other uses. Then someone reminded me that autonomous vehicles will just enable people to drive longer because they're not really driving, they're sitting and looking at their iPad or their cell phone while they're driving, so that it'll contribute to sprawl. So we have our vision, and we'll let that vision shape how autonomous vehicles are used in Knoxville. And we're definitely thinking about that. We have our vision crafted in Knoxville. And believe me, last summer was the most I'd spent inside in my entire life. I know that Knoxville is hot and humid after last summer.
Andy wants to add something, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, just real quick. Jonah and I were talking about this during the break, and I thought it was really, it was something that was talked about in the last discussion. And it just hit me, you know, I'm of a different generation than some of the people in the room. And so to somebody of my generation, a car was freedom. So the day you turn 16 years old, you're standing at the DMV and you don't fail your driver's test like these kids. They don't go get them. Today, you know, a computer is freedom. The internet's freedom. So they're not interested in getting, you know, they're more interested in walking and biking and so on. So I think when you say we need to spend more time on the vision than the how to sell, I think we need to spend time on both, because like he's saying, you make a great plan, and if you sell it wrong, you know, it doesn't get off the ground. So I think the engaging of gentrification, differences in age is a really interesting topic, and sounds like it may come up in the next, so I'll let it go.
All right, well, let's thank our panel. We're going to show a short documentary on driverless cars and city building, and then Jeff Welch is going to talk with us a little bit and give us some comments, and then we'll wrap up with some comments from our panelists. So let me introduce Jeff Welch. If Andy and Gerald wouldn't mind, we'll bring Jeff up and have a seat for you. Jeff is the director of the Knoxville Regional Transportation Planning Organization. He has over 35 years of experience in the field of transportation planning. He's a native of Wisconsin and graduated with a degree in geography, has a master's of urban and regional planning from Virginia Tech, and a master's of science and engineering from the University of Tennessee. So I think we're ready for our final documentary. Okay, Jeff.
Wanted to add a few comments to that. This is an issue, obviously, it's just as the video just stated, it is, and Wolf indicated too, it is coming. You know, just like the computers were coming, it is coming, and like it or not, we're going to be part of a shared mobility, autonomous vehicle society. I'm not sure when, you know. When it comes to Knoxville, is that 10 years from now, or is it 30 years from now? But it will be coming to segments of our community, whether it first approaches the university first, or it hits the trucking industry first. We don't know, but it is coming. It is, the questions raised in this video, how is it going to shape our community? How are we going to react and plan to this, you know, technology that is coming? Is it the urban areas and the suburban areas? A million questions out there about who's going to be implementing, who's going to be maintaining it, who's going to be liable for all of this, who's willing to share vehicles, how do we change culturally? But it is coming, and I think we need to be prepared for it. As part of that effort, our organization, the TPO, will be wanting to sponsor a forum, a discussion of that later this summer about and getting individuals, you know, architects, planners, technology folks involved in not the nitty-gritty of how autonomous vehicles are going to work, but how is it going to shape our community? How do we plan for, this autonomous vehicles, and how do we, shape, as Gerald indicated, what do we do with the parking garages? Or will we need to continue to have parking garages? Will the cars be just hovering and floating all over the place, and there'll just be continued congestion? But how are we going to react to that, and how do we plan for that is going to be really critical as we shape our zoning ordinances, as we shape and look at our plans throughout East Tennessee. So please look forward to engaging yourselves in this discussion, and it's going to be something that's going to be an ongoing dialogue that we're going to be having, because it will be changing every day as we you look at everything. This next IT company is now merging with the next automobile company, and the next automobile company is merging with this IT company, and Google's doing this, and Uber's doing that. So it's just happening so fast, but we got to be part of the discussion here in Knoxville and our regional area. So I thank you all again for being here tonight or this afternoon, and I know we want to have some wrap-up comments from Phil and David here on the sessions throughout there, last night and to today, and your thoughts. I appreciate it.
And I think that in terms of the opportunity now with the autonomous cars and the whole issue of smart cars and smart cities is one of my big concerns is not exacerbating the inequalities that we have built into our current system, and how do we make sure that we don't leave the most vulnerable people in our society behind as we're planning for the future. And just, I don't think that really got raised necessarily in that documentary, but I think it, obviously we only have so many minutes, and there might be other ones that do talk about some of that stuff, but just a thought in terms of that very specific thing. So I guess, David, you're going to go ahead first.
Yeah, I actually would like to respond to that a little bit, because a group of transportation planners and engineers recently got together and sort of started to talk about, this idea, this sort of scary idea, autonomous vehicles are coming. It almost sounds like Jaws is kind of about to attack us. And as we